Hey guys, it's Courtney and I'm here with another video for Simon Hurley Create. Today we're going to be using the Supermom stamp set as well as the POW stencil, and we're going to be creating a pop-up card that requires no dies at all. So I am going to start by coloring my images. So I'm going to go ahead and stamp out some of the images from the stamp set onto a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. Normally I'd use the Stark White cardstock by Simon Hurley, but I'm saving that for my heavyweight. There's a lot of bulk to this card, so I don't want to use too much, I guess, thick cardstock. So I went ahead and stamped out the images with Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink. You can use any Copic safe ink or whatever medium you end up coloring with, as long as the ink is safe for that medium. I did have to stamp these a couple of times. As you can see, some of the images are quite large, and of course I've never stamped these before. So I did stamp them twice just to get that bold black outline. And then we're going to move on to the Copic coloring, which I kept pretty simple. So for the little, I guess you could call it the skyline of the city, I'm only going to color in the windows because this is going to be kind of a nighttime scene, I guess you could say. So I want the windows to appear to be on. So I'm going to use just plain yellow. I'm not going to bother to do any shading. You certainly can, but I'm keeping it nice and simple. And I'm going to color in the windows solid with this one building here. And then I'm going to switch over to a different yellow for this other building. You could do the same yellow, but I figured it would just add a little bit of extra interest to the background to use two different yellows. Next, we're going to go ahead and color Supermom here, and I'm going to start off with her skin tones. And by the way, there is a little girl here. I would assume that this is Super Daughter. And I'm going to color her the same way, so I didn't bother to keep that in the video. But I am starting with my lightest color to map out the darkest areas or where my shadows will be, which will kind of be off to the right-hand side, being she's faced that way. And then on the lower part, or the part towards the bottom of her legs, there's not much skin showing. Going to go ahead and add that darkest color, then the mid-tone colors. I used a 4-color blend, and then finish off with that lightest color that we started with. Next, I'm going to move on to her hair, and I kind of color hair differently than I color most things. I usually start right off with my darkest color, and I use flicking motions regardless of the shape of the hair. And this will kind of give some texture to the hair, and you just kind of want to make sure that you go in the direction of her hair. So her hair is kind of flowy and wavy in certain areas, so your flick lines also want to kind of go in that same direction. To be quite honest with you, it doesn't really necessarily matter where you put your highlights and shadows, just as long as there is a difference, and you'll notice that you get a lot of texture. So I started with that E59, and then I'm just going to extend those flicks out a little bit further with the E57, E55, and save the E53 for just the highlight color. You'll notice that I'm not doing a whole lot of blending here. I'm just kind of flicking where I left off with the previous color so that I don't over blend my colors. If you over blend your colors, you're going to lose that texture anyway. So just, you kind of want to move a little bit quick. So once her hair was done, I'm going to move on to her outfit, and I'm going to be using pinks and purples. And I'm going to start off with my purple combination. Now, both of these color combinations tend to end up in places you don't want them to be, kind of like reds. So I'm going to start with the purples, and I'm just going to be super careful when I have to go around the darkest areas with the next color combination, just because these colors tend to drag out and you end up with them in places you don't want them to be. So you just want to be kind of careful. So like always, I'm starting off with that lightest color, which is that V01, and I'm just mapping out the darkest areas. And you can see that her little skirt is kind of not folded, but there would be some creases in it. And where those creases are, I am just creating a triangle. And I'm going to do that with the darkest color too. You can see that I'm using the V09 pretty sparingly, but I am adding those little tiny triangles where her skirt would kind of be folded up a little bit, or folded, not folded up, but folded. Next, I'm going to move on to the V06. I'm just going to extend these areas out a little bit further. And I'm also going to extend these little triangles. I'm going to make them a little bit taller, and I'm going to make them a little bit wider. I also added a little bit of a shadow underneath her hand, where her hand is kind of over her skirt. That would cast a shadow as well. I'm going to do the same thing with the Z oh my gosh, V04, including those little triangles, just extending those up and out just a little bit, and then finish off with that V01 and just kind of blend these colors together. Now I'm being careful not to go over the darkest area with this V01 because it is going to act as a colorless blender and move those colors around. You don't necessarily want to move those colors around. You just want to get those to blend. And you can see that that adds some nice texture to her skirt. Next, for her cape and her gloves, I'm going to switch over to a pink combination, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm starting off with that lightest color to get those areas mapped out. And you can see that her cape is kind of flowy, I guess you could say, towards the bottom. And I'm going to do the same thing with those little triangles, only this time they're going to be a little bit longer. Now, I put my triangles where that wavy line is. I put my triangle where it is up, where the wave goes up. But you can do anything you want, that as long as you kind of keep it consistent. So going in with the darkest color, again, using that pretty sparingly, including those little triangles, you'll see that those are really tall and skinny triangles at this point. And then I'm just going to move on to the mid-tone colors and extend those triangles up a little bit each and every time, and out a little bit each and every time. I also added a little bit of a shadow underneath where it's coming from behind her, just because I felt like it was going to be too light or end up with too much of that highlight color. So I ended up adding a shadow there, even though there might not necessarily be one. Don't be afraid to do that. Kind of just play around. As long as you have a variation in color, nobody's going to pick it apart and make sure that you put the shadows exactly where they need to be. So finishing off with that RV23, again, that lightest color, and just blending everything out. And that is it for Supermom. And next, for the letters, I'm going to color in these letters to kind of match. So again, I'm not going to be too concerned about a light source here, but I'm just going to pay attention to the shape of the letters. I'm going to fill them in with the lightest color to get my colors to blend a little bit easier. Then I'm just going to add a shadow where one letter is overlapping another and off to the left-hand side, just to kind of keep things a little bit consistent. And I did use the same 4 colors that I used for her. I did the same thing with the wow, only I colored the wow with the purple combination, and the background I just colored solid with one of the pinks. I didn't bother to do any shading there. And again, colored that little girl the same way as I colored Supermom, except I just switched things. I colored her cape purple, just to kind of mix things up a little bit. Once all of my coloring was done, I fussy cut all of my images. You could certainly use a scan and cut if you have one, but I didn't bother. It's just easier for me to fussy cut if there's only a few images. I did take a white gel pen just to kind of fix up some areas where I wasn't too careful. With these darker or brighter colors, it's easier to fix your coloring mistakes with a gel pen rather than trying to use your colorless blender. It's just going to move around your color and you're going to end up with a big mess. So I'm going to work on the front of the card, which is the simplest part of the card, and I'm going to bring out that POW stencil. I'm going to use a piece of the Stark White cardstock by Simon Hurley, and I'm just going to tape this down with some Post-it note tape to the back of the stencil. I'm going to bring out 2 of the Simon Hurley Create inks. I'm going to use Crown Me and Triple Berry. I'm using a blending brush. You can use a regular blending tool, whatever you have. Going to start off with the Crown Me. This is more of a bright purple. And you can see that I'm just going to go around all 4 sides of my card panel. I'm not really worried about these blending. These blend beautifully. These inks blend beautifully. You never end up, or at least I never do, I never end up with like those globby areas that you do sometimes with dye inks. These just go on the paper and blend beautifully the first time around. It doesn't take any practice. So moving on to the Triple Berry, I'm just going to get these colors to blend a little bit around the edges and then save the inside or the middle of my card panel for the lightest area. This is cut down to 5 1/4 by 4, so it's just a little bit smaller than an A2 size card. I matted this onto a piece of black cardstock that's just a little bit larger than the panel, but a little bit smaller than a card base itself, just so that I have a little bit of a black outline and a little bit of a white outline when I adhere this to my top folding A2 size note card. Now I'm using wet glue, and my sentiment is going to be that wow sentiment, and that is going to go right there in the middle. Now you can see it kind of gets lost a little bit. So in order to make this really pop, I am going to go ahead and cut a border for this on black cardstock. So I'm going to stick this down to my black cardstock first. I'm just using wet glue. You can use a double-sided tape or whatever you want. Once the glue has a couple of seconds to set, and the Tombow Mono Multi-Glue sets pretty quickly, I am just going to fussy cut around it. Now, I know I'm off camera a little bit, but I'm just fussy cutting as usual, just making sure that instead of using or leaving a white border around my image, I'm essentially just leaving a black border around my image, and this will really make it pop. Now, I didn't adhere this down to my card base yet because I wasn't sure if I wanted to pop it up with some foam tape or just glue it flat. So I'm just going to kind of put that aside for now. Next, we're going to work on the inside of the card. First, I'm going to start off with my sentiment, and I'm taking another piece of the Nina Solar White, again, because it's a little bit thinner and we're going to have a whole lot of bulk. I'm going to take one of the sentiments from the stamp set, bringing out my Mini Misty just in case I have to stamp this multiple times, and this way I can make sure it's straight. You can see that I'm putting this a little bit towards the bottom of the card panel, and you'll see why in a minute, but I'm going to go ahead and stamp this out again with that Blackout Ink by Ink on 3. I did have a cat hair stuck to that, so I wasn't able to manage to find it. I don't usually find it in time, but went ahead and stamped that out, and I'm just going to color in these letters. I'm not going to do any shading to these letters just because they are a little bit smaller, and at this point I just didn't want to be bothered with it. So I colored in the letters with one of the purple colors and then the shadows with one of the pink colors, and I wasn't overly careful. I did definitely go out of the lines, and again, you do not want to use a colorless blender with the RV markers or the V markers, so I did just touch those areas up with a white gel pen. Now, in order for your card base to open and close properly, you do want to trim down this panel just a little bit. I didn't even bother to measure, but I did take a little bit off of both sides just so that my sentiment is still centered. And then I just took a little bit off the top or bottom. I don't even remember what I did, just so that you have a little bit of a border, and you'll see why once we add all the bulk. So I went ahead and adhered that down again with my Tombow Mono Multi-Glue to the inside of my card, and I'm also taking a piece of black cardstock. Now, this black cardstock is cut down to 5.5 by 4.25, which is exactly the same size as an A2 size card, and I'm going to adhere this down to the back of the inside of the card, and this is basically going to be my background. Now, you can do an ink blended background if you prefer, if you want to add even more detail, but I kept it simple and just adhered some black cardstock down. Now we are going to work on adding our images to the inside. And again, this is going to be a pop-up card. So in order to make this super simple, you do not need any dies for this. I am going to take some heavyweight cardstock. This is the Stark White cardstock by Simon Hurley. It's got nice weight to it. And I'm just going to cut some strips. Some of them are thicker than others. You want, depending on the size of your image, and you'll see why in a minute. And I'm going to take this thick one here, and I'm just going to, and you don't necessarily need to do this because I eyeballed the rest, but I'm just going to line this up in my paper trimmer, and I'm just going to take a pencil to mark off the evenly. So it's 4 inches. I marked off at every inch, and I'm just going to fold it. You can use a scoreboard if you want, or a scoring tool. I don't bother to do that because nobody's going to see this part, so it doesn't need to be perfect. You can see I didn't fold it perfectly, and I just trimmed off the excess. Now, in order to make this a little box, I'm just going to use Scotch tape. You can use anything you want, but you want to make sure that it's strong enough. So you're not going to want to necessarily use like Post-it note tape or washi tape. You want to make sure that you have something that's a little bit more permanent. Now, to adhere this to the inside of the card, this is going to be for my skyline. So I'm going to adhere my little box here to the back of my card, the inside of my card base. I know this is going to where I'm going to get tongue-tied and it's going to be a little confusing, but I'm taking my wet glue. That way I can reposition it if I need to, because I have a couple of seconds, and then I'll add wet glue to the front of the box and add my image. Now you want to make sure that you have some time for the glue to set, especially if you are using wet glue, but you can see that the box will just fold. The box that's holding that image there is just going to fold as you open and close the card. So I went ahead and created some more of these little boxes with all different dimensions and all different sizes for my other images. And again, just used the Scotch tape to hold these together. Now, once these are done, I can adhere the rest of my images. So for my Supermom and this POW, I want this to kind of be the star of the show here. So I'm going to have her kind of sticking out a little bit further than that POW. So I'm going to use one of the boxes, the skinnier boxes, but it's still got a lot of dimension to it. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to adhere that with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to the back of my card base, and then adhere the image to the front of that little box. Same thing for the little POW. Now, before you start opening and closing your card, to make sure that it opens and closes, you want to make sure that your glue is set. Now, the Tombow Mono Multi Glue becomes permanent probably after a minute or so, completely permanent. But you do want to give it even a couple of extra minutes. And I didn't have room for this little girl, so I just adhered her to my little skyline here, completely flat, as if she's standing in front of this little city here. I noticed another coloring error, so I did have to fix that up with my white gel pen because I was noticing a whole lot of coloring errors on this one. So now that my glue has completely set and completely dried, I can go ahead and make sure that my card completely closes. Now you may have to play with it a little bit, but you can see that everything closes up nicely as long as the images are tucked where they need to tuck. So mom is sticking out a little bit more than that skyline, so she kind of needs to be tucked behind the skyline, and you can see that it will fold up nicely and fit into an envelope. I did end up adhering this sentiment to the front with just some Tombow Mono Multi Glue because I had way too much bulk here, but that is it. I finished off with a little bit of shimmer to some random areas, and that is it for today's card. As always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.